All right, so growing trees from seed, let's continue the conversation here. If you're at a point now where you have gathered all your seed and processed them, and you've either stored them or determined you're ready to plant right now, you've got a lot of different options as far as how to actually go about planting that seed. And so the first option is just literally to sow the seed out where you want there to be trees. So right now you can see me kind of digging a hole in some mulch and weeds and throwing in some black walnuts. General rule of thumb, you can bury a seed at least 1 to 2 times the depth of the actual diameter of the seed, and they'll be able to punch through that just fine. So there I was burying the seeds in some mulch. You can also just literally throw the seeds out into an open area. And using this method, we are mimicking nature, right? That's what would happen in nature. But just remember that when nature sows seeds this way, she's sowing millions and millions of seeds to get maybe a dozen trees. And so if you have a lot of seed, or if you're not super concerned about germination rate and exactly where the trees are, you can just throw out seed like that, and that's great. Another option is to grow the trees out in some sort of pot or air pruning bed. You're looking at some pots on the right, obviously, and this is an air pruning bed on the left, which we can talk more about in a little bit. But so you can grow a tree in one of these two systems because pots and air prune beds make the trees relatively easy to transplant. Or you could also grow trees in an in the ground bed, basically just a raised bed in the ground or a garden bed. And the key there is that you want to have soil that's pretty loose and easy to dig in so that when you transplant the tree later on, it's relatively easy to do. If you're going to grow trees in pots, my recommendation is to try to use used pots. I think it's generally good to be using as minimum amounts of new plastic, and there are so many used pots in circulations. People throw them out in the spring and the fall all the time in the suburbs, and you can call nurseries and they're typically swimming in used pots. So try to use used pots if you can. I've got some videos on making makeshift air pruning pots. If you're really into air pruning but you want to use pots, you can make some air pruning pots, or that might be a good reason to get some new pots, is if you really want some specific air pruning pots. So I've mentioned air pruning a couple times now. Oh yeah, one other big thing with pots. It's a good idea to keep them up off of the ground. I have had trees shoot roots through the bottom of the pot and into the ground, especially if they're sitting on mulch. So I keep them up on pallets to prevent that. But air pruning, right? So this is an air pruning bed you're looking at right here. And I've made some other videos in the past. By the way, there's a wasp nest forming in between my two air prune beds, so I have to be pretty careful throughout the rest of this video because I'm working next to some wasps. Luckily it's cold out, so they're not really super active this day. But anyway, the air pruning is basically just exposing the bottom of the growing container to air. You can see I have a screen on the bottom like that, so the roots, when they get to the bottom of the container, they don't hit a hard stop. They can punch right through that screen. They're exposed to air, and that's going to cause gentle pruning of the roots. The air will cause them to die back at the tip, which sounds bad, but it actually encourages the roots to branch out, and you'll get really nice, strong, fibrous root systems that are easy to transplant, and the tap root will still be intact, right? So it's a really good way to be able to grow deep tap-rooted trees and have them be easy to transplant without damaging the tap roots. That's the benefit of air pruning. I like to build these air pruning beds, but like I mentioned, you can make air pruning pots, and it's one way to go of many. But yeah, whether it's pots, air pruning beds, in the ground beds, or direct sowing, those are kind of the basic methods you have available to you for planting tree seed. All right, so if you're growing in pots or an air pruning bed, you're going to have to fill it up with some sort of soil medium. I like to use a lot of leaf compost in my mix, and we can talk more about soil later on in the video. But you basically just fill up the pot or the bed with your soil mix, or if you're growing in the ground, you amend your soil in your preferred way. Prepare the bed in your preferred way, and then you just sow the seeds. And so you can sow them really close together, like where my hands are touching right now, or kind of further apart, like what you can also see here. If you sow them really close together, like these black walnuts, for example, were sown really, really close together, just a ton of black walnuts in there, and you can see they came up and grew really well. The trade-off is that the more densely you sow the seeds, typically the smaller the trees will be in their first year. I don't think there's any way that you can overdo it the trees will, for the most part, get along and all grow. It's just if you have them really dense, the trees will be smaller in their first growing season. If you spread them out a little bit, the trees will get bigger. I guess the other thing to mention is that the more spread out they are, the longer it will take during the growing season for them to close the canopy. So you can see I'm spreading them out here real far. I might have to do a little bit more weeding earlier in the season, but hopefully these chestnuts will get bigger. And you don't have to be exact with your spacing. I'm kind of, I'm really not being exact, but I have these nice pretty little lines that I'm making in this bed. You don't have to do it that way. I just decided for these chestnuts that I wanted to. But like I said, there's really no right or wrong when it comes to sowing the seed. Sow as thick or as sparse as you see fit. It's really important to label things and also to note, if you don't have enough seed to fill up a whole bed and you want to utilize the rest of the bed space for something else, have labels and have delineations, have gaps in between different species so that it's easy to tell at the end of the season what's what. I didn't have enough chestnuts to fill this bed, so I'm putting hazelnuts in the other half, and I'm going to leave a good gap in between them so that it's easy to tell what is what at the end of the season when they lose their leaves. I mean, when you're looking at a twig, you can examine the buds and the bark, and there are ways to tell trees apart without their leaves, but it's just generally easier if you have some space in between, right? So, and you can check out these wasps. They're still pretty cold, and they definitely were not happy about me being there, but they were allowing me to work without bothering me, so I was grateful for that. The next step, if you're in an air prune bed, and especially if you're planting anything that rodents like to eat, like those chestnuts and hazelnuts are very desirable, you're going to want to protect them. So for my air prune boxes, I make these cages. I have a nice cover. You can see the screen is coming down over that lip. There's hopefully no ways for rodents to get into this box. And this also allows me some extra height so that I can add some mulch in on top of these seeds. I mean, it's basically just prepare your soil, sow your seeds, mulch them, and then if you're going to do any rodent protection and all that, do that. And it's also good to water them in the day that you plant them. But you can see here I've got some mulch down. I use a mix of aged leaves and aged wood chips. I think that's the best mulch. But again, it's kind of like the soil. Use whatever you got and whatever works for you, Anyway, maybe now's a good time to kind of backtrack to soil. And bed prep and general stuff. Like I said, I like to use a lot of leaf compost because it's easily available to me. I can make my own. I can, get it from the municipality for relatively cheap if I need to. Trees grow in the forest where there's a lot of naturally occurring leaf compost. So sometimes I just fill these beds in my pots with straight up leaf compost. Sometimes I'll mix in other types of compost or sand, or whatever I have, wood chips. I do like to put a little bit of wood chips typically at the bottom of my pots and the bottom of my air prune beds, kind of like a hugelkultur, in a pot type deal. I've talked about this in other videos. The air prune beds themselves drain really well. You don't have to worry too much about aeration and drainage and whatnot. Pots, it's more important to have good drainage, so maybe mixing in something like perlite or vermiculite to aid in water distribution and drainage. You can see here, we're looking at a raised bed that I have built, and you can certainly grow trees in the ground in beds like these where you're just, piling on a bunch of compost and wood chips and mulch and any sort of organic matter over the years, and you're building up the soil and making it easier and easier to dig. That can be a great place to grow trees. If you're working on ground you've never grown in before, it might be good to do an initial tillage or something to break up some compaction and maybe, remove some of the weeds. That's totally up to you, whatever bed prep you like. But, over the years, if you're piling down organic matter, things generally are going to tend to get better each and every year. It's probably important to note that I'm doing all this planting in the fall where I live, but you could do this in the spring if you stratified your seeds in various ways, like I'm showing how I stratify walnut seeds in buckets if I'm not going to direct sow them in the ground. So if you stratify your seeds, you can do all this planting stuff in the spring. It is important to keep your seeds watered if you go through a dry spell, especially if you're in the spring and it's going to be time for them to start sprouting soon. But even in the winter, if you get a really, really dry spell, maybe consider watering your seeds if they're already planted out in beds. The other thing too is, if you're dealing with a lot of the smaller seeds, in this video I showed a lot of larger seeds, but smaller seeds, once they germinate, they are very delicate for the first few weeks, maybe the first month or so, while the plant is still very small. That root is very shallow, and the top of the soil dries out really fast generally in most systems. The top of the soil is the most sensitive to drying out. So if you're trying to grow small seeds, right, elderberry seeds, for example, really small, juneberry seeds, really small, be sure to be watering those plants very frequently, be checking on them frequently to make sure that they do not get really stressed out or die from lack of water. Some of the larger seeded crops, and especially as things begin to get larger and kind of hardier, they need less watering, right? They become a little bit more self-sufficient. The other thing to mention, air pruning beds and in the ground beds can go much longer without water, generally speaking, compared to pots. Pots can't go quite as long without water. Anyway, yeah, I think that's kind of the basics to get started on growing trees from seed. Don't get too caught up on the soil stuff. I think just like I said, use what you got and just keep experimenting and iterating and see what works for you in your situation. Trees are generally not super picky. Keep an eye on watering, mulch as much as you can. And really, the ultimate teacher is experience. So you just got to get out there and do it. Try not to think about it too much. Just, get some sort of loose plan together, gather some materials, get some seed, and go start planting and just kind of see what happens. The trees will teach you what they want. That's basically how I've done it. It's really fun growing trees from seed, and I highly recommend it. So I'll probably talk more about this soon as we move into fall and I start digging and transplanting more trees, but I just wanted to show an example right here of a black walnut that I just pulled out of an air pruning bed so you can get an idea for the size and overall structure of what the root system can look like. You can see it still has a very intact, pretty massive taproot, but a lot of horizontal, fibrous branching roots going on there. So this is a really nice tree to transplant. It should be ready to take off when it gets into its forever home. And then just a little glance back at what some of these trees looked like in the very early summer, as they're really starting to get going into the growing season. And, that's obviously not the time of year it is now, but I don't know exactly what time it'll be when y'all are watching this. And, before we know it, it'll be the growing season again. And that's what this is all about, is trying to grow these trees. And, yeah.